What's going on, everybody? Welcome into yet another edition of the Baseline Jumper podcast. My name is Jason Goldstein, and on the line with me right now is a part-time podcast host, part-time songwriter, probably going to ditch me soon once he wins a couple of Grammys, Ben McDonald, ladies and gentlemen. Ben, why don't you let the people in on what you've been working on?
Well, I have been called the songbird of my generation, a combination of Fergie and Jesus. So, I've got some side projects going, Jason. I don't want to get too into them, but let's just say I've been told it might win the Grammy for Best Album of all time.
So, being a little secretive to start the show off this week, huh? I see how it is. Training camp starts next week, and you want to be secretive. I get it. I totally get it. Next week, hopefully, you'll be a bit more open. But you know what's not a secret? Team USA had their worst finish ever in international competition, finishing in 7th place at the 2019 FIBA World Cup. Good enough to qualify for the Olympics next summer in Tokyo, as we talked about last week. But that performance was just downright embarrassing. The close loss to France, being completely out of it in the consolation game against Serbia. And then, hey, they beat Poland. Yay, 7th place. Woo! We're not going to spend too much time on this. But, Ben, what are your thoughts on the U.S. finish?
I think it was a disgrace, really. I think it's really embarrassing. A lot of people, actually, I've been surprised how many people have reached out to me this week to talk to me about it, knowing that I'm a basketball guy, and kind of, what are your thoughts? I had some family members who actually asked me about it just yesterday. And I think that one of the things that really struck me about this was that the U.S. just wasn't ready to have other teams match their talent level. And for the first time since professional United States basketball players have played in the Olympics and FIBA, the U.S. did not have the best player on the court during these games. The 2 games they lost, they did not have the best player on the court. And quite simply, and quite frankly, Jason, it showed. And the way that they lost those games was really indicative of the fact that this U.S. team, who seemed to have a great experienced coach and all these guys who were ready to, be veterans and play for their country, just didn't know how to play together. And the USA roster was not shaped in a way that complemented. When you contrast the U.S. roster to some of the other teams, you see teams like Spain and Argentina who ended up getting to the finals. They don't have nearly the talent of the U.S., but neither do they have the talent of a team like France, maybe even Australia, and certainly not Serbia, who boasted maybe the best player in the tournament and the best NBA player who had been remaining in the knockout round. And what I mean by that is that Bogdan Bogdanovic was probably the player of the tournament, and then Nikola Jokic was probably the best player remaining once Giannis left. But that said, even in the game against France, they just looked outclassed, and they just didn't seem ready, Jason, to play with teams that could match their talent level. And I'm not sure what this means going forward. Certainly there's going to be better players in the future, but I don't know if it bodes well. And it has to have a little bit of a demerit for Coach Popovich, doesn't it?
It does, but I think you have to chalk it up to the personnel because the U.S. had so much wing scoring and not enough shooting. As good as Joe Harris is, and he's really shaping up his game to be a really well-rounded, all-around player. He can defend, sets good picks, and obviously was the best three-point shooter in the league last season. But that's not enough. They were missing the shooting of a Klay Thompson, a Kyrie Irving, a Kevin Durant, all of these superstars who opted not to play this summer. And it showed because the U.S. had a ton of wing scoring, Harrison Barnes, Donovan Mitchell, but they were so reliant on Kemba Walker. And in the games in which he struggled, the U.S. just wasn't getting it together. The big men, as good as they are on an NBA stage, Brook Lopez, Mason Plumlee, Miles Turner, outside of Turner, their games did not really translate internationally. And I think the U.S. suffered for it. So they finished 7th. Now the focus shifts to what do they do for next summer? Does Anthony Davis, Damian Lillard, James Harden come walking through that door and say, okay, we're ready to play? Because I think Greg Popovich needs that very badly if the U.S. is going to compete in Tokyo. They're going to have some of these guys just based on, I don't know if you want to call it a respect thing, but they went out and they battled this summer. It was a bunch of select team players and guys that probably would have gotten cut making the actual roster. So I think we'll see a couple of those guys next summer. I think we might see Kemba Walker. I think we might see Donovan Mitchell. We might see one of the other Celtics. But other than that, they need help. And they need these superstars locked in for next summer and hope that a lot of them do play in 2020.
Well, I mean, I think Mitchell was easily the best player on the U.S. during this tournament, and it really showed why Popovich had given him some of the leadership responsibilities. But I mean, Jason, I have to, before I go anywhere else, I have to reiterate, you're so right. The lack of shooting for this team was the biggest thing. They just did not have the shooting. They didn't have the complementary pieces. And it really doomed them. But you're absolutely right. There's only a couple guys who will be here. Although I wonder, I mean, obviously I know Popovich is signed on, but you almost have to wonder if he could get kind of ousted here or end up stepping down just from the way that this went. It was so bad. And one of the things too, Jason, is that one of the common links between this team and the team in Athens that underachieved is Greg Popovich. He was a coach under Larry Brown that year as well. And it's been mentioned in a few places that, the U.S.'s biggest disappointments really in international competition have both come with Popovich there. So I do have to say, as much as I love, I don't think so either. But as much as I love him, I mean, it's hard to completely let him off the hook when he was the head coach. And ultimately, I didn't feel like the game plan was really up to snuff against some of these other opponents.
See, I think it was the personnel. You look back on that Athens team, and it had, Tim Duncan, who should not be leading the U.S. as good as he was in international competition. He was a complimentary player. Your captain was Richard Jefferson. You had Lamar Odom, Stephon Marbury, Allen Iverson, LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony after their rookie years. I mean, you can't make those comparisons because Jason Tatum is not LeBron James. Okay, Donovan Mitchell is not Carmelo Anthony. So you can't say, these guys coming off the rookie years are going to vault into superstardom. I think it was two completely different groups of players. This team, I think, acted like they wanted it more. They just didn't have the talent. It just shows how much talent there actually is worldwide. We've talked the past couple of weeks about Serbia. Spain, who wound up winning the whole thing, has been an arch nemesis of the U.S. for years. Argentina, Greece, all of these teams with NBA-level superstars. It's getting tougher and tougher. And I think the 2020 Olympics is going to pose a huge challenge for the United States. So I do think they really have to get at least 2 or 3 of those superstars that opted out this summer to opt in next year.
I completely agree. And I think the other part of this, though, is that you can't just throw those players together the way that they've done. I mean, if you look at these teams, one of the big storylines, I think, was the continuity of the two teams that made it to the final. And they were not the most talented, but they had teams that played together, and they had guys who complemented each other. And if you looked at, say, Argentina, their point guard was a great shooter who could penetrate a little bit and really played a great role for the rest of those guys. The team was just built around complementary players, and those players had bought in and wanted to play for the team. And, for the U.S., maybe that's the other piece of this is, if you are going to risk not getting these guys anyway, maybe you don't focus as much on some of those superstars and you try to focus on getting yourself a team that will play within a system and try to get these guys who will actually play together, because this year what ended up happening, and I don't think you can downplay this, and this is the one place where I give Coach Pop a bit of a pass, is that he didn't know what his roster was going to be until pretty much the whole thing was starting. I mean, it was a complete, thrown together roster. Guys were opting out until really just the last days before they were leaving. I mean, De'Aaron Fox was supposed to be on the team, and I think it was the last exhibition game or one of the last ones, he ends up deciding he's not coming. I mean, you have to feel a little bit for the coaching staff to not know who you're going to have. It's very hard to design a system, and then it sort of manifests itself in this sort of your turn, my turn type of offense, and it's harder to install plays and sets and so on. So, I mean, I think that's a big part of it too, Jason, that we, as a country, we have to do a better job too of really like actually instilling a culture on that team and a system and a way of playing so that guys can kind of come in, and it didn't feel like that happened this year to me.
No, it didn't. And now Popovich returns to San Antonio to coach the Spurs, a team in which no one's talking about. So I think it's time and we continue with our baseline jumper NBA season preview. Last week, we covered the Central Division and heard Ben talk ad nauseum about the Bulls. Now, neither of us have a horse in the race tonight, but we are going to cover the Southwest Division, home of the three Texas teams, the New Orleans Pelicans, and the Memphis Grizzlies. So why don't we go ahead and start with the Spurs, because this team never wants to go away, and no one's talking about them. However, I want to start this coverage by asking you this question. Do you think that Popovich, coming off the heels of this performance in FIBA, he's got the FIBA, will you think he'll be motivated as ever due to Team USA's failure in the FIBA World Cup? Do you think that he'll translate that motivation into training camp with the Spurs? I mean, he had Derek White on the team with him. So do you think that's going to be a motivational standpoint when training camp opens, or do you think that they're two separate entities?
Jason, are you saying that Popovich is going to make an Alamo-like last stand in San Antonio this year and fight till the bitter end? Sorry, some bad Texas puns there, but
I think you need to river walk yourself out of this podcast right now, okay?
Oh man, people are going to turn the podcast off. But you know what, Jason, you're absolutely right. I think that this is a team where he is going to be motivated, and ultimately this is a talented team. They do have a lot of potential. There is one, I think, big glaring elephant in the room, Jason, and that is DeMar DeRozan. And I think he is going to be really the X factor for this season. I think he's going to be the one who determines what happens with this team. He has 1 year left on his deal, if I'm not mistaken, and it's basically going to determine how they decide to play the year. If they know he's leaving, there's a very good chance they either try to trade him or they decide to kind of figure out what they're going to do next and maybe have a little bit more of a youth movement. So I think he's going to be a really interesting piece. Obviously, as currently configured, I think this team is a playoff team, a team that could win in the mid-40s. But if he was to leave, Jason, I mean, then all of a sudden they're going to slip in the West. So, I mean, what do you make of DeMar DeRozan, who just to correct myself, he has a player option after this year, but more than likely he's going to be the marquee free agent if he opts out, and is probably quite likely to do so. So what do you make of that situation? What do you think the Spurs end up doing with that?
So the NBA is now moving away from the big three era, and they're moving into dynamic duos. And the Spurs have one that is really nothing to sneeze at, okay? It's DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge. Now, is that Kawhi and Paul George? No. Is that LeBron and Anthony Davis? No. Is that Westbrook and Harden, who we'll get to a little later? No. But it's still pretty good. Two guys that have been bona fide all-stars throughout the course of their career. So I think DeMar is going to be extremely motivated, because when you look at the 2020 and even the 2021 free agency class, it's not a lot of quality out there. A lot of players with options that could end up hitting the open market in 2 years. But DeMar's playing for a contract in San Antonio. I mean, where else could you see him going? I think that he wants to build on what Duncan, Parker, and Ginobili have left behind in San Antonio. As competitive as the West is going to be, I think the Spurs are going to be better than everyone thinks. They can never be counted out. But if things go sideways, we might start to finally hear the R word in San Antonio, rebuild. And, you said in one of our very first episodes that you feared that San Antonio might finally be heading towards that rebuild. And they've continued to prove us wrong.
It's true.
If this season goes sideways, you could see Popovich maybe leaving, DeMar leaving, Aldridge leaving, and the Spurs starting from scratch. Popovich is not going to coach forever. So I think that not only is Pop motivated, but DeMar has to be motivated. He's probably still upset about the trade from Toronto because they went and they won the championship without him the next year. So I think there's plenty of motivation to go around. And that is one dynamic duo to start with in Aldridge and DeRozan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this season could really either go one of two ways for the Spurs, Jason. And I'm inclined to say that they're going to tough it out. But if they really don't feel like they're going to keep DeRozan, whether they don't want to or they just can't, and he says, I don't really want to